Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to talk about John Smith and excerpts from his work, The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, which are what we now refer to as Bermuda. So in this work, John Smith is doing something similar to what Christopher Columbus was doing, and he has a similar goal. He wants to put himself out there and make a name as this really awesome explorer who's really smart and brave and awesome. So what you want to remember is that he's a social climber. Okay, he started out as a farmer's son, and he wants to be known as this kind of gentleman. Now remember that the way that the English are using the term gentleman at this time, it's to describe a landed person. So someone who owns land, someone who has titles, they don't do work with their hands, that kind of stuff. It's not about having proper manners. It's not about chivalry. It's about class and rank. So they look down on your normal average person, your average blue collar worker, so to speak. So we're already starting to see some of the class issues that are still present today, such as which people are deserving of help. That kind of conversation has really been with us since before we were a country. And John Smith is part of that conversation, and he's trying to be a social climber, to elevate his position in society through his reputation. Columbus did this too, but if you remember, Columbus was not very successful. He ended up in chains and disfavor, but Columbus told blatant lies. He talked about cannibals and things like that. He said things that once people got to the New World could be very easily disproven. Whereas John Smith, he's taking a different approach here. He's telling things that are more or less true, but he's embellishing them. So he's just embroidering the story. Now, obviously, we do know that it took Smith's party a pretty long time to get to North America, especially by today's standards. And we're starting in the third book. So we're not going to look at the story of the voyage here in this excerpt. He's talking about how they themselves, people like him, were not given very good rations. That's where we start. And there is a lot of context there to understand. John Smith talks about Edward Maria Wingfield a lot in this passage. Now, factions arose on ships during this kind of long passage across the ocean. And he's using this text here as a little bit of a diss track, as it were, to besmirch Wingfield. So when the ships leave to go back to England for supplies, they get a little bit of biscuit and they would trade them. So the sailors would trade the biscuit for, quote, money, sassafras, furs, or love. So Smith is saying that Wingfield kept all the good stuff for himself, right? He had oatmeal, he had oil that he could cook things in, make them taste better. He had aqua vitae, which was brandy. He had beef and eggs and whatnot. But people like John Smith didn't get any of that. And to get the crappy hardtack that the sailors would either steal or just keep, left over, they had to trade things of much greater value. So money, what little of it that they had, and of course that's the whole point of them being there, is to get more money, or sassafras, which was very valuable and used for medicine, fur, which of course was very valuable for trading, or love. So John Smith is throwing shade on Wingfield, who is his political enemy in this passage. And he's saying, we are here doing this hard labor, and we're doing it in these extreme conditions with the heat that so weakened us, caused sufficient to have made us as miserable in our native country as in any other place in the world. So he's saying, a lot of us died when we got here, and it's Wingfield's fault, and he could have prevented it if he had shared with us instead of hoarding all of the good stuff. And what ends up happening is they have a coup. They kind of deposed the establishment, and they have to justify that so that they're not, guilty of a crime. They overthrow Wingfield and they established Ratcliffe in his place. And this might have surprised you if what you're used to is the Disney version of events where Ratcliffe is the big villain. Ratcliffe and John Smith historically were on the same side. You need to keep in mind, Disney does not tell you the true story any more than John Smith does. Do not use Disney as your historical basis for what happened here. So now they've got Radcliffe in as a new president, but things aren't getting any better because they've used all their food. The sturgeon are gone, so fishing season is over, and all help is abandoned. Each hour expecting the fury of the savages, when God, the patron of all good endeavors in that extremity, so changed the heart of the savages that they brought such plenty of their fruits and provision as no man wanted. And this is very similar to what we see in the writings of our Spanish conquistadors as well. We see divine intervention. It's almost an echo of that European concept of divine right to rule. It's God himself who is on their side. It's God who changes the hearts of the savages and leads them to take care of us, right? The savages can see the goodness of John Smith, but it's because of God. God makes that happen. And if God is on their side, then nothing that they do can be wrong, okay? So again, you want to pay attention to these kind of propagandistic things that are happening in this literature. So remember that he says here, you know, we thought we were only going to take 2 months or so for the sea passage. And so that's how much food that we packed. They thought that they would have the whole spring to work, but they were at sea for 5 months. And so they ate all of their food over that 5 months. So they didn't have any food left for planting. And even if they did have food left for planting, they had missed their planting window. So they have both spent our victual and lost the opportunity of the time and season to plant by the unskillful presumption of our ignorant transporters that understood not at all what they undertook. Wow. So we've got two things happening here in this passage. One, he is throwing the sailors under the bus. I don't really know how you could have reasonably expected to have a really super accurate idea of how long this passage would have taken. It wasn't exactly common. It's not like people have the 2 o'clock transatlantic sea passage every day, right? They don't know what the conditions on the ocean are going to be like exactly. And quite frankly, they should have been prepared for unexpected delays. So that's on them. Two, it's not really accurate for him to claim that this group of men were intending to settle for a long period of time and that they were planning on planting and creating this kind of long-term settlement. Okay, that was never the plan. And I think it's important to point out here too that they were all men, because you don't have a group of all men if you're planning a long-term settlement. There are traditionally quite a lot of different types of labor done in these establishments by women on these homesteads that even your average male farmer wouldn't reasonably have been expected to know how to do, and let alone a group of all men that are wanting to be seen as gentlemen, right? So you can't say that this was their plan. The Virginia Company, again, it's a corporation, and they are there to look for gold and silver like the Spanish had found further in the south. Of course, there's no gold or silver in Virginia, so they weren't going to find any, but they don't know that yet. They expected to be in and out very quickly within a few weeks, and when they left, to be laden down with riches, so they're not wanting to overburden their boats with cargo. They're wanting to have lots of space that they could fill it up with all this gold and silver. So John Smith is really, again, spinning the story here. He's wanting to make himself look good, and he's trying to make it seem, oh yeah, we were going to come and we were going to lay down roots and all this stuff. And it's all just the sailors' fault that didn't happen. And it's the sailors' fault that we were in such dire straits without any food. But that's really not exactly true. They were planning on coming to stay for a little while and then go back home. And it didn't happen that way. And he's kind of in charge, so now he has to find someone to blame. A little bit further on down the line, we see him doing this kind of spinning of the narrative again, but this time it's more of a positive thing. It's more of a fun bit of self-promotion. He's a lot about that self-promotion. I like to think of him as, kind of colonial Kanye. He says, the new president and Martin being little beloved, particularly Martin, of weak judgment in dangers and less industry in peace, committed the managing of all things abroad to Captain Smith, who by his own example, good words and fair promises, set some to mow, others to bind thatch, some to build houses and others to thatch them, himself always bearing the greatest task for his own share, so that in short time he provided most of them lodgings, neglecting any for himself. All right, aside from the massive character slander of Captain John Martin there, notice how he's talking about himself in the third person. He's trying to make you forget that he's the one who wrote this. And he uses all of this wordplay to over-exaggerate his own contribution. I mean, it's probably true that John Smith did get a lot of stuff done. And as far as we know, he was put in charge. He was a farmer's son. His dad was very good at farming. They were very prosperous, so he probably had a reasonable sense of what it would actually entail to make a farm run well, and, there by extension to make this colony successful. But it's the way that he tells the story that's important here. He takes himself out of it. And by doing that, he makes this kind of narrative distance between the narrator and the audience, as though someone other than him is telling the story. He's trying to make it sound like it's other people boosting up John Smith and continuing the legend of John Smith. And if you look at the way he describes himself, he talks about his good words and fair promises, and how he's always keeping the hardest work for himself, and how he'd never dream of asking anybody else to do such hard things, and how he didn't even give himself a house until everybody else had a house. And he's just really playing himself up here. He's building up his own reputation, and it's really funny once you start noticing the way that he never puts himself in first person, because he really does not want you to notice that that's what he's doing. Now, he also tells several stories about getting the better of the indigenous population, which invokes the trope of the noble savage. Now, the noble savage is a concept that was first named by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, but it's been around for a lot longer, pretty much as soon as you had any sort of contact between European cultures and indigenous cultures. And it's this literary trope of, this primitive person, and you can kind of think of like Adam and Eve before they ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they're sinless because they're just too primitive and naive and just frankly simple for the concept of sin. They don't have a concept of good and evil. And if they're brutal, it's in this animal kind of way. They're just too pure to have malice. But it's important to note here that anytime you have a noble savage, you're also going to have an ignoble savage. So you can't have one without the other. And an ignoble savage is nothing but evil. It's the pure id of the human spirit. It's humanity without civilization to rein in our worst impulses. And this is going to help lay the justification for the European colonization of the rest of the world, alongside, divine right to rule and other such concepts. And these literary works are what helps spread that idea. So pay attention to it when you see it. Now, in one of Smith's stories, he goes down the river, and this is what he says. He says, "At first they scorned him as a famished man, and would in derision offer him a handful of corn, a piece of bread for their swords and muskets, and such like proportions also for their apparel. But seeing by trade and courtesy there was nothing to be had, he made bold to try such conclusions as necessity enforced, though contrary to his commission. He let fly his muskets, ran his boat on shore, whereat they all fled into the woods. So marching towards their houses, they might see great heaps of corn. Much to do he had to restrain his hungry soldiers from present taking of it, expecting, as it happened, that the soldiers would assault them, as not longer after they did with the much hideous noise." So first he tells us this story that he went and tried to trade for food. And we know that this was the starving time, and they're not doing well. So he immediately is gunning for sympathy. He tells us, he tried to trade for food and they just wouldn't do it because, they need their food. You can't just expect that people are going to say yes to everything you want just because that you want it. He doesn't tell us what he offered them in trade. He just says he wanted their food. And Smith characterizes their offer to him as insulting. They are offering him some corn or a piece of bread for this extremely lopsided agreement. I'll give you a handful of corn for your musket, or I'll give you a piece of bread for your coat. That's pretty much the same terms as they had with the sailors at the beginning of the tale. They'd get some hardtack for their money, or they'd get hardtack for furs, for example. But he has a problem with it now. So he tells us he shot at them. And he knows he wasn't supposed to, but he did it anyway because, guys, what do you want me to do? Oh, we were hungry and they were being mean. That's kind of what he's saying. But give it to him. He kept the guys from stealing all of their stuff, right? Because they could have done that. And he knew they wanted to do that. He's okay with shooting at them for their disrespect. But he did keep their guys from absolutely robbing them blind, and he deserves credit for that. So you should pay attention to the way that these details are presented, that concept of narrative framing. And then he tells us, then they came after me, right? 60 or 70 of them. Some black, some red, some white, some multicolored. And he's othering them right there, this huge mass of them, and they're all scary. He's talking about the indigenous people in war paint, right? And they came in a square order, so that's their battle formation, singing and dancing out of the woods with their oki, which was an idol made of skins, stuffed with moss, all painted and hung with chains and copper, borne before them. So again, he's painting them as very savage and uncivilized. They have this doll that they're using to protect them. And then Smith mocks their weapons, saying, in this manner they were very well armed with clubs and bows and arrows. And they charged the English that so kindly received them with their muskets. So yeah, they rushed us with their primitive sticks and we shot them. These scary painted dolls who were yelling, or the scary painted guys who were yelling at me holding a doll. Guess what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna shoot them. So yeah, he's showing how overpowering their forces are. Down fell their god, and diverse lay sprawling on the ground. The rest fled again to the woods. So this is our might compared to their superstition. In other words, we're better. They're uncivilized. They have clubs and bows and arrows, and we have advanced weaponry. They have dolls, but we have God on our side. We're smart, they're dumb. We're big, they're little. We're right, they're wrong, and there's nothing they can do about it. This is the kind of story he tells a lot. Smith is saying, look how we outsmarted them to get what we wanted. We're better than them in every way, essentially. And he says, and at the end, they departed singing and dancing in sign of friendship. Because they just recognized how much better we were. Sure, I'm super sure that's how that happens. But again, Smith is the one controlling the narrative. He is telling the story, so he's able to take these events that were probably mostly factually true and spin them however he wants, because he's the one telling us what happened. So always keep that in mind. Who is telling the story? Who were they telling the story to? What purpose do they have telling the story? What changes might they have made? And we see this action, or we see this idea in action a little further on when Smith goes on to tell us, yet what he carefully provided, the rest carelessly spent. So again, nothing's ever his fault. Look what I'm doing for these guys. I went above and beyond to make sure they're taken care of. And still these jerks back in Jamestown are blowing it. Nothing's my fault. I'm in charge, but nothing's my fault, ever. It's not ever my fault that anything went wrong. And he also takes this time to take an opportunity to throw shade on Spanish people. So we have that little bit of propaganda going on here too. He says, the Spaniards never more greedily desired gold than he victual, nor his soldiers more to abandon the country than he to keep it. But he found plenty of corn in the river of Chickahominy, where hundreds of savages in divers places stood with baskets expecting his coming. So he's saying, we wanted to find so much food. We were starving so badly that there was never a greedy Spaniard that wanted gold more than we wanted food. And we ended up, we found what the Indians had hidden because we were just that desperately motivated that we wanted to eat as much as those dirty Spaniard people would kill for gold. And by this point, we've already got the Black Legend of Spain. I mean, remember, England was super late to the game of exploration. France had gotten there already. Denmark had gotten there already. Everybody is in the New World before England. So everybody has already heard the stories of the awful things that Spain has done, partly because of, Bartholomew de las Casas. So John Smith is playing on that a little bit. How greedy they were and all the awful things that they did. Well, that's how much we wanted food. So nothing we do is our fault, right? And then we get some more discussion of how things are never his fault. Our comedies never endured long without a tragedy, he says. Some idle exceptions being muttered against Captain Smith for not discovering the head of the Chickahominy River. And of course, he has kind of an attitude about that. And he being taxed by the council to be too slow and so worthy an attempt. So he's again setting up his capture now, saying, I had to go make yet another attempt to do this really hard, impossible thing, but I have to do it because it's super important. And they seem to think that I can do this super important thing that's super hard, like in 5 minutes. And they're out here saying, I can't do it fast enough, even though I'm doing literally everything there is to be done. And they're just a bunch of lazy, jerks. It's never enough for them. And I wouldn't have ever ended up in this situation if everybody had just pulled their weight to start with. And then we get one of the honestly funniest stories. You kind of have to imagine it in your head, but pay attention to the details. Because the way that John Smith tells this story of his capture, he is setting himself up to be the last great action hero. So he's gone with a couple of men. They're going up the river to try to find, the source of the river. And eventually they get to a part where they can't go any further because the river is blocked. It's got all these weeds, maybe it's got some tree limbs, whatever. They just can't go any further. They have to go by foot. So he leaves his barge behind and he tells all the guys he's brought with him, I'm going to go by myself, stay hidden. I'm just going to take 2 of you English guys with me and a couple of natives, but the rest of you are going to stay here and I'll come back. And this is what he says in the text. He was not long absent, but his men went ashore, whose want of government gave both occasion and opportunity to the savage to surprise one George Casson, whom they slew, and much failed not to have cut off the boat and all the rest. Now, we're not really sure what exactly happened to George Casson, but John Smith tells us that he didn't have any real patience, he didn't have any discipline, and he failed to obey orders. And my God, that's how he got killed. Wasn't John Smith's fault. Had nothing to do with John Smith leaving all those people behind. It was him. It was all him. All him. Nothing to do with John Smith. But again, the only person whose story we have is John Smith's. So who really knows? And he goes on to say, well, we didn't know what was going on back there. We had no idea that all this was happening. So we just kept going. We got to the river's head finally. And my 2 English dudes that were there with me, well, they were lazy bums. So while I'm out doing all this work to map the head, they fell asleep in the canoe and they got killed. I didn't have anything to do with it. I was doing work. Wasn't on me. So at this point, it's just John Smith. He's the only English person left, right? Again, not his fault. Not his fault. He just miraculously is awesome enough to be the only one to make it. All the other guys just managed to get themselves killed by being lazy, insolent, undisciplined rabble. He had nothing to do with it. And suddenly he finds himself surrounded by 200 savages. Okay? 200. 200 against 1. 200 to 1. Think about that. 200 to 1, all right? 2 of them, he says he killed. So he manages to get 2 shots off. Which, okay, fine. I could see that if you have way better weapons, 1 guy could kill 2 guys, even if you're surprised. And then he says he grabs one of his native guides that he has with him and uses his sock garters to tie this guide to his arm as a human shield, which apparently does not take any time at all. So John Smith claims he has 200 guys like encircling him who are presumably actively shooting at him this whole time. And he has the time to grab one of his guides and hold on to him while he undoes his sock garter, tie it to his arm, one-handed. We'll go with it. Maybe he's Thor. I don't know. And he uses the shield as a buckler. Now that's the part that goes on your forearm. So he's kind of holding him here, right? And he just got a little shot in the thigh. Just a little. 200 guys surrounding him, just barely wounded. Says he had a lot of arrows stuck in his clothes, but he didn't take any great hurt. Just imagine, this looks like a Looney Tunes cartoon, right? But they did manage to take him prisoner. So, I mean, yeah, at this point, this is a Jackie Chan movie or something. Nothing about this sounds just even remotely plausible. The story that John Smith tells is that he is this legend, and that even though 200 guys are surrounding him and shooting him, and his clothing is full of arrows, he just gets a tiny little wound on 1 leg. And he managed to use a human shield, and all of his other men are dead, but they just take him prisoner. And that's the story. And if you notice, in the story, the number of enemy combatants jumps from 200 to 300, like your grandpa, when he's talking about that fish he caught. And it just keeps getting bigger. Now, he was taken prisoner. We do know that. But the rest of it, we need to use our own judgment as to how much of it we trust, and how much of it is John Smith absolutely making it up as he goes along. So he goes on to say, when this news came to Jamestown, much was the sorrow for his loss. But again, he wasn't there. So he's kind of making it up, or at best relying on hearsay. But by writing it in the 3rd person, it makes it sound a lot more objective and therefore a lot more believable. Then Smith goes on. He's telling the story about when he meets various members of the tribe, and he meets who he calls the king of Pamunkey, which we would have to assume here would be the chief, or Pocahontas' father. And Smith gives him this round ivory double compass dial. Much they marveled at the playing of the fly and the needle, which they could see so plainly and yet not touch it because of the glass that covered them. So it's like magic technology. And this compass story is an example of this concept of romantic primitivism. So that is this idea that really does fold in and encompass the noble savage. It's look at these people who are so completely untouched by society and civilization. So it romanticizes the primitive, in other words, right? Oh, look, they're so pure. Look at all the things we can do for them. So we can bring them so much with our society and our civilization. A lot of times it really ignores the value of the civilization that the colonists are kind of interacting with. It says we can bring them our science, we can bring them our medicine and our technology. Like, look, they don't even know what a compass is. It says they all stood amazed as with admiration. I mean, notwithstanding that they had tied him to a tree and were going to shoot him. No, after the compass, he's a god, right? So he gets out of being killed here because he has this mighty technology. And so they kindly feasted him and yada, yada, yada. And we end up with this yet another dehumanizing description of the indigenous people. And further on, Smith talks about how Presently came skipping in a great grim fellow, all painted over with coal, coal mixed with oil, and many snakes and weasel skins stuffed with moss, and all their tails tied together so they met on the crown of his head in a tassel. And round about the tassel was a coronet of feathers, the skin hanging round his head, back and shoulders. In a manner covered his face with a hellish voice, and strange gestures and passions, and 3 more such like devils came rushing in. And again, it's not so much the description of how the people are dressed and behaving that's the problem, it's the constant usage of words like devilish and hellish and that kind of thing. The use of the word savage that is othering. It's not a dispassionate academic thing that we might expect today from anthropologists. Smith calls the natives fiends. He talks about his being scared and not knowing what's going to happen. And he talks about things like how the natives would plant gunpowder hoping it would grow into guns. And they go to Werowocomoco, and we finally get this story of Pocahontas, the one that we all grew up with. And of course historians debate as to whether or not this ever actually happened. But remember, this particular text was written after Pocahontas had died. This is years later. In the most generous treatment of Smith's reliability, he's using maybe notes that he took, and he's definitely relying a lot on memory. And this is not a diary as we think of them today. This is certainly not any kind of like in the moment observing like we might think of an anthropological study. He is talking about how every 4 or 5 days Pocahontas would come and bring food, and now we absolutely can confirm that. But you can see that what he's doing in this text is he's very much trying to play up himself and his importance and value, and not just getting Jamestown started and doing all this heavy lifting and all this work and how they would have never made it without him, but also how they would have died that first winter without him. That it was just him. He's the only reason that they even had food, because Pocahontas saved him. And she saved him because he was awesome. Right? Anybody else she wouldn't have bothered. So he's once again playing up that it was him. And even though parts of it are historically accurate, he's absolutely playing up the propaganda. He's wanting to show, look at me, I'm John Smith, I'm awesome, you want to keep me around. Now, whether his like homecoming court campaign worked or not it's a matter of debate. He's obviously very popular today in the American legend. But remember, this is the guy who was forced to return to England for medical treatment after the Great Gunpowder Incident. A bag of gunpowder just kind of magically appeared in his lap while he was taking a nap and exploded. So you can kind of figure out for yourself what they were trying to do with that. And he never came back to Jamestown after that. He did come back to the New World. He is the guy, he named New England because he mapped New England, and this is after Jamestown. And he actually tried to get Miles Standish's job on the Mayflower. He really was the most obvious choice to be the Pilgrim's guide. The person who drew the map of New England is probably the guy you'd want to take you around. But the problem was absolutely nobody liked him. Remember how poorly this all got started because of his unpopularity. People saw through him. People heard the rumors and the stories about what he was like. But he's definitely a storyteller, and his stories got well remembered. So I think ultimately he got his wish, and he was certainly influential on the American legend. So whether or not he was successful is something I think that you're going to have to determine for yourself.